Hello, history enthusiasts, time travelers, and knowledge seekers. Welcome to another journey back in time here on Backdrop History. Chapter 1: Prelude to Change. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as societies in the Western world were undergoing significant transformations due to the Enlightenment, industrialization, and political revolutions, a growing dissatisfaction among women with their limited roles in society began to emerge. This dissatisfaction would sow the seeds of what would later become the women's suffrage movement, a crucial and transformative battle for equality. During this time, traditional gender roles were deeply entrenched, relegating women to the private sphere of the home, where their primary roles were perceived as nurturing, managing households, and raising children. Women had limited access to education, property rights, and economic opportunities. Their legal status was largely subordinate to men, with little or no voice in political affairs. However, as societal changes unfolded, women increasingly found themselves questioning their assigned roles and yearning for a more active participation in public life. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, individual rights, and equality, played a crucial role in shaping the intellectual climate of the era. Enlightenment thinkers such as Mary Wollstonecraft, in her seminal work A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, argued passionately for the equality of women, challenging the prevailing assumptions about their intellectual and moral capacities. Wollstonecraft's ideas laid a solid foundation for the future suffrage movement, inspiring subsequent generations of women to demand their rights. Industrialization, which brought about significant social and economic changes, also contributed to the growing discontent among women. The rise of factories and the shift from agrarian to urban societies disrupted traditional gender roles, as women increasingly entered the workforce to support their families. Yet, despite their economic contributions, women were denied the same legal and political rights as men, leading to a sense of injustice and inequality. The political revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, such as the American Revolution and the French Revolution, further fueled the desire for equality and democratic principles. The rhetoric of liberty, equality, and the rights of man resonated with many women, who began to question why they were excluded from participating fully in the new political order. Women like Abigail Adams, the wife of American revolutionary John Adams, wrote letters advocating for women's rights and urging her husband to remember the ladies when drafting laws. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 marked a watershed moment in the prelude to the women's suffrage movement. Organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, this historic gathering brought together men and women who were increasingly dissatisfied with the status quo and advocated for women's rights. The convention, held in Seneca Falls, New York, aimed to address the various grievances faced by women and to draft a manifesto outlining their demands. The Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the U.S. Declaration of Independence, articulated the injustices faced by women and called for gender equality in all spheres of life. The Seneca Falls Convention ignited a spark, setting in motion a series of discussions, debates, and organizing efforts that would shape the trajectory of the women's suffrage movement for decades to come. It provided a platform for women to express their frustrations, share their experiences, and collectively envision a future where women's voices and perspectives would be valued and represented. Chapter 2: The Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention, held on July 19 to 20, 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, stands as a landmark event in the history of the women's suffrage movement. Organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a passionate advocate for women's rights, and Lucretia Mott, a renowned abolitionist and women's rights activist, the convention brought together a diverse group of over 300 men and women who were determined to address the grievances faced by women and demand equality in all aspects of life. The seeds for the convention were sown during the social and political ferment of the early 19th century. Influenced by Enlightenment ideals and inspired by the struggles for abolition and women's rights, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott recognized the urgent need to organize and mobilize women to fight for their own liberation. Their vision was to create a platform where women could come together to discuss their grievances, formulate demands, and forge a path toward achieving their rights. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention of its kind in the United States. It brought together women and men from various backgrounds, including reformers, abolitionists, and religious leaders, who shared a commitment to challenging the prevailing gender norms and advocating for women's rights. Among the attendees were influential figures such as Susan B. Anthony, who would go on to become a central figure in the suffrage movement, and Frederick Douglass, a prominent African American abolitionist and orator. The convention began with an opening address by Lucretia Mott, who emphasized the urgent need for women's rights and the importance of organizing for social change. Following Mott's speech, Stanton delivered her famous declaration, in which she proclaimed that all men and women are created equal and called for the recognition of women's rights in society. This declaration set the tone for the discussions and debates that would unfold over the course of the convention. The attendees engaged in spirited debates on a wide range of issues, including women's suffrage, property rights, education, and employment opportunities. These discussions highlighted the systematic discrimination and inequality faced by women in all aspects of their lives, and underscored the urgent need for social and legal reforms to address these injustices. One of the most significant outcomes of the Seneca Falls Convention was the drafting and adoption of the Declaration of Sentiments, a document modeled after the U.S. Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Sentiments detailed the various grievances faced by women and asserted that women, like men, were entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It called for equal rights in areas such as education, employment, property ownership, and, notably, the right to vote. The inclusion of suffrage as a demand in the Declaration of Sentiments was a groundbreaking and controversial move. At the time, the idea of women voting was seen as radical and went against the prevailing social and political norms. However, Stanton and the other attendees recognized that without the right to vote, women would lack the political power necessary to effect meaningful change and challenge the patriarchal order. Although the Seneca Falls Convention did not immediately lead to widespread societal change, it marked a turning point in the women's suffrage movement. It provided a platform for women to voice their concerns, articulate their demands, and solidify their commitment to the fight for equality. The convention also sparked a ripple effect, inspiring the organization of subsequent women's rights conventions and catalyzing the formation of suffrage organizations dedicated to achieving women's voting rights. Chapter 3: Suffrage Organizations and Strategies. In the wake of the Seneca Falls Convention, the women's suffrage movement gained momentum as suffrage organizations sprouted across the United States and Europe. These organizations played a crucial role in coordinating efforts, mobilizing supporters, and formulating strategies to achieve the goal of women's suffrage. Two of the most prominent suffrage organizations in the United States were the National Woman Suffrage Association, NWSA, and the American Woman Suffrage Association, AWSA, each with its own distinct approaches and priorities. The NWSA was founded in 1869 by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, two leading figures in the suffrage movement. The organization was committed to securing women's suffrage through a constitutional amendment at the national level. Stanton and Anthony believed that the existing political and legal structures were inherently biased against women and that a radical and confrontational approach was necessary to effect change. They argued that women had a natural right to suffrage and demanded immediate and unconditional enfranchisement. The NWSA pursued a wide range of strategies to advance its cause. Stanton and Anthony, both prolific speakers and writers, utilized the power of rhetoric to disseminate their ideas and mobilize supporters. They organized lectures, conventions, and rallies, where they passionately advocated for women's suffrage and exposed the injustices faced by women in society. The NWSA also published newspapers, including The Revolution, which served as a platform for spreading their message and rallying support. In addition to their rhetorical efforts, the NWSA engaged in direct political action, such as lobbying Congress and petitioning for suffrage rights. They organized protests, including the famous suffrage parades in New York City and Washington, D.C., to raise awareness and press for change. The confrontational nature of the NWSA's strategies often elicited strong opposition and ridicule from anti-suffrage groups and the general public, but it also galvanized support and brought the issue of women's suffrage to the forefront of public discourse. On the other hand, the AWSA, led by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, pursued a different path toward achieving women's suffrage. Founded in 1869, the AWSA aimed to secure suffrage rights through a state-by-state approach, focusing on securing incremental victories rather than immediate national change. Stone and her colleagues believed that by gradually convincing individual states to grant women the right to vote, they could build momentum and lay the foundation for broader national suffrage. The AWSA prioritized building alliances and coalitions, working closely with other reform movements, such as temperance and labor rights, to promote women's suffrage. They believed that by linking suffrage with other social and political issues, they could appeal to a broader base of support and increase their chances of success. The AWSA also emphasized education and public outreach, using reasoned arguments and peaceful persuasion to win over hearts and minds. While the NWSA and AWSA differed in their strategies and priorities, both organizations shared a common goal: the achievement of women's suffrage. Their approaches were informed by the prevailing political and social climate of the time, as well as the personal beliefs and convictions of their leaders. The NWSA's confrontational tactics challenged the status quo and demanded immediate change, while the AWSA's gradualist approach aimed to secure suffrage rights incrementally. It is important to note that these organizations were not the only suffrage groups operating during this time. Various regional and local suffrage organizations sprang up across the United States, each contributing to the broader suffrage movement in its own way. The diversity of strategies and tactics employed by these organizations enriched the suffrage movement, ensuring a multifaceted and dynamic approach to achieving women's suffrage. Chapter 4: The Long Battle, Persistence and Resistance. The fight for women's suffrage was a protracted and arduous struggle that spanned several decades and faced formidable opposition. Suffragettes confronted not only systemic barriers but also deeply ingrained social, political, and cultural resistance to their demands for equality. This chapter explores the challenges faced by suffragettes, the opposition they encountered, and the persistent strategies they employed to advance the cause of women's suffrage. One of the primary sources of opposition to women's suffrage came from politicians, who feared that granting women the right to vote would disrupt the existing power structures and upset the societal order. Many politicians argued that women were naturally suited for the domestic sphere and that participation in politics would compromise their feminine virtues and maternal responsibilities. These views were reflected in legislation that denied women the right to vote, effectively marginalizing them from the political process. Religious leaders also played a significant role in opposing suffrage. Drawing on biblical interpretations, they argued that women's subordination was divinely ordained and that granting them suffrage rights would challenge traditional gender roles and undermine the stability of the family and society. Such arguments resonated with conservative elements of society and bolstered opposition to the suffrage movement. Perhaps most striking was the resistance faced from within the women's community itself. Some women, influenced by societal norms and traditional beliefs, were wary of challenging the established order. They feared that advocating for suffrage would be perceived as unfeminine, radical, or threatening to their families and social status. This division among women posed a unique challenge to the suffrage movement, as suffragettes sought to convince their own gender of the importance of achieving political equality. Anti-suffrage propaganda played a significant role in shaping public opinion and creating obstacles for the suffrage movement. Opponents painted suffragettes as unfeminine, radical, and even dangerous to society. Caricatures and cartoons portraying suffragettes as masculine, neglectful mothers, or hysterical women were disseminated widely in newspapers and magazines. Such imagery aimed to discredit the suffrage movement and deter women from supporting it. Despite these challenges, suffragettes demonstrated remarkable resilience and persistence in their pursuit of equality. They organized rallies, marches, and protests to raise awareness and gain public support. The Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, in the United Kingdom, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, became particularly known for its militant tactics. Suffragettes engaged in acts of civil disobedience, such as breaking windows, hunger strikes, and even chaining themselves to railings. These actions were intended to draw attention to their cause and disrupt the status quo. The suffrage movement also embraced strategic alliances and collaborations with other social and political causes, recognizing the interconnectedness of various struggles for equality. Suffragettes recognized the common goals shared with other reform movements, such as the fight against slavery, labor rights, and social justice. By forging alliances, suffragettes expanded their networks of support and demonstrated the broad societal impact of achieving women's suffrage. Suffragettes also employed various forms of media and communication to spread their message. They published newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches that articulated their demands and countered anti-suffrage arguments. Leaders such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Emmeline Pankhurst delivered powerful speeches and engaged in public debates to educate and inspire others. Their tireless efforts helped shape public opinion and build support for the suffrage cause. Over time, suffragettes began to make significant progress in their fight for equality. Small victories, such as securing voting rights in certain states or territories, provided momentum and hope. These incremental successes challenged the prevailing narrative that women were unfit for political participation and demonstrated that women's suffrage was not a radical idea but a natural extension of democratic principles. Chapter 5: International Perspectives. The women's suffrage movement was a truly global phenomenon, extending far beyond the borders of the United States. Across Europe and other parts of the world, suffragettes and suffragists fought for women's rights, each country offering unique perspectives and strategies in their struggle for suffrage. This chapter explores international perspectives on the suffrage movement, highlighting key figures and events that shaped the fight for equality. In the United Kingdom, the suffragette movement emerged as a prominent force in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters, the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, adopted more militant tactics compared to their American counterparts. Frustrated by the slow progress of the suffrage movement, the suffragettes engaged in acts of civil disobedience, hunger strikes, and even arson. Their actions were intended to shock the public and draw attention to the cause of suffrage. The suffragettes faced significant opposition, including violence and imprisonment, but their determination and resilience ultimately played a crucial role in securing women's suffrage in the United Kingdom in 1918. In France, the suffrage movement took on a different character. Women's rights activists, such as Hubertine Auclert and Maria de Reismes, worked to challenge the patriarchal norms and advocate for women's political participation. The suffrage movement in France was closely tied to broader struggles for social and political reform, including the fight for workers' rights and education reform. Suffragettes organized protests, published articles and pamphlets, and participated in international suffrage conferences to raise awareness and build support for their cause. It was not until 1944 that women in France finally gained the right to vote. In Germany, the suffrage movement faced significant challenges due to the country's political and social context. The German Empire was highly conservative, and women's suffrage was seen as a threat to the established order. However, women's rights activists such as Helene Lang and Anita Augsburg persevered and worked tirelessly to challenge the status quo. They founded suffrage organizations, organized public lectures and rallies, and engaged in political lobbying. Women in Germany achieved limited suffrage in 1918 and gained full voting rights in 1919 with the establishment of the Weimar Republic. Australia also played a significant role in the suffrage movement, with women's suffrage achieved at the federal level in 1902. The suffrage movement in Australia was characterized by strong grassroots activism and alliances with other reform movements, such as the temperance movement. Women's suffrage was seen as an integral part of the broader struggle for social justice and equality. Figures like Vida Goldstein and Catherine Helen Spence emerged as influential leaders, advocating for women's rights and organizing campaigns to secure suffrage. The suffrage movement in each country was shaped by its unique political, cultural, and social context. In some cases, suffragettes faced intense opposition and hostility, with their activities met with violence and repression. However, their persistence and determination ultimately led to significant victories and paved the way for future generations of women. It is important to note that the suffrage movement extended beyond Europe and Australia. In countries such as New Zealand, Finland, Norway, and Denmark, women gained suffrage rights earlier than in many other parts of the world. The suffrage movement in these countries was often intertwined with broader social and political transformations, such as democratization and the push for social welfare reforms. Chapter 6: Turning Tides, Breakthroughs and Milestones. The suffragette movement, with its unwavering commitment and persistent efforts, achieved several breakthroughs and significant milestones that propelled the fight for women's suffrage forward. While progress was often slow and hindered by opposition, a series of victories in various countries around the world provided inspiration and momentum for suffrage activists globally. This chapter examines some of the major turning points in the suffrage movement, including the granting of voting rights to women in New Zealand, Australia, Finland, Norway, and Denmark. In 1893, New Zealand became the first country to grant women the right to vote in national elections. The passage of the Electoral Act in September of that year marked a historic milestone in the suffrage movement. The legislation extended voting rights to all adult women, making New Zealand a trailblazer in the struggle for gender equality. The success in New Zealand was a testament to the persistence and tenacity of suffragettes who had fought for political recognition and enfranchisement. The victory in New Zealand was followed by another significant achievement in Australia. In 1902, Australia granted women the right to vote in federal elections and to run for the Australian Parliament. This breakthrough was the result of years of determined advocacy and grassroots activism. Women like Vida Goldstein and Catherine Helen Spence, among others, played instrumental roles in mobilizing support and pushing for legislative change. The granting of suffrage in Australia signaled a growing recognition of women's rights and set an example for suffrage activists worldwide. Finland, known for its progressive stance on gender equality, became the first European nation to grant full suffrage to women in 1906. The Finnish parliament passed the Act on the Parliamentary Elections, which removed gender restrictions on suffrage and allowed women to participate fully in the democratic process. The achievement in Finland was a significant milestone in the global suffrage movement, challenging the prevailing notion that women were unfit for political participation. Norway, another Scandinavian country at the forefront of women's rights, granted women's suffrage in 1913. The Norwegian parliament enacted legislation that extended the right to vote to all adult citizens, regardless of gender. The suffrage victory in Norway was the result of years of tireless activism by women's rights organizations and suffragettes, who campaigned for political equality and social justice. The breakthrough in Norway further propelled the suffrage movement forward and demonstrated that gender-based barriers to political participation could be dismantled. Denmark joined the ranks of progressive nations granting women suffrage in 1915. The Danish parliament passed the Women's Suffrage Act, which granted women the right to vote and run for office. The suffrage victory in Denmark was the culmination of sustained advocacy and organizing by women's rights activists who sought to dismantle gender-based discrimination and secure equal political rights. The achievements in New Zealand, Australia, Finland, Norway, and Denmark were not isolated events but part of a global wave of progress in the suffrage movement. These victories served as beacons of hope and inspiration for suffrage activists worldwide, fueling their determination to continue the fight for political equality. The impact of these breakthroughs extended beyond the immediate granting of suffrage. They demonstrated that the exclusion of women from the political process was an injustice that could and should be rectified. These milestones challenged societal norms and paved the way for further advancements in women's rights, both within and beyond the realm of voting. The suffrage movement became a catalyst for broader gender equality struggles, with suffragettes increasingly engaging with issues such as reproductive rights, equal pay, and legal reforms. Chapter 7: The Final Push: Suffrage in the United States. The suffrage movement in the United States reached its climax in the early 20th century, as suffragettes intensified their efforts to secure voting rights for women. Through large-scale parades, picketing, and acts of civil disobedience, suffragettes confronted opposition and challenged the status quo. Their unwavering determination and sacrifices ultimately culminated in the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution in 1920, a landmark victory that forever changed American history. In the early 1900s, the suffrage movement in the United States experienced a renewed wave of activism. Prominent suffragettes such as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Alice Paul, and Carrie Chapman Catt led the charge for women's suffrage and mobilized supporters across the country. These women recognized the need for a unified and coordinated approach to achieve their goal and formed powerful suffrage organizations, including the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NASA, and the National Woman's Party, NWP. Suffragettes employed various strategies to raise awareness, challenge societal norms, and advocate for their cause. One of the most significant tactics was organizing large-scale suffrage parades and processions. These visually striking events, often held in major cities, drew attention to the suffrage movement and showcased the determination and breadth of support among suffragettes and their allies. The 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., which attracted thousands of participants, marked a watershed moment in the suffrage movement, capturing national attention and igniting public interest. In addition to parades, suffragettes engaged in picketing and protests, particularly targeting government institutions and public spaces. The White House became a focal point of suffrage demonstrations, with suffragettes picketing daily to demand presidential support for a federal suffrage amendment. Known as the Silent Sentinels, these women endured arrests, imprisonment, and harsh treatment at the hands of authorities. Their resilience and determination garnered public sympathy and drew attention to the suffrage cause. Suffragettes also utilized the power of public speaking and education to promote their message. They delivered speeches, organized lectures, and distributed literature to educate the public about the importance of women's suffrage. Suffrage leaders, such as Carrie Chapman Catt, traveled extensively, delivering powerful addresses that outlined the case for women's enfranchisement and addressed common objections. The suffrage movement aimed to dispel myths and misconceptions surrounding women's suffrage, challenging the notion that women were unfit for political participation. The suffrage movement faced significant opposition from anti-suffrage groups and individuals who feared the disruption of traditional gender roles and societal norms. Anti-suffrage propaganda was widespread, often portraying suffragettes as unfeminine, radical, and a threat to the family unit. Nevertheless, suffragettes persisted, countering anti-suffrage arguments with reasoned arguments and highlighting the positive impact that women's suffrage would have on society. The final push for suffrage in the United States gained significant momentum during World War I. Suffragettes capitalized on the war effort to emphasize the importance of democratic principles and women's contributions to the nation. They argued that women, who were working in factories and serving in various roles during the war, deserved full citizenship rights, including the right to vote. The suffrage movement presented itself as a patriotic cause, linking suffrage to national unity and democracy. The turning point in the suffrage movement came on August 18, 1920, when the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified. The amendment stated that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The passage of the 19th Amendment marked a significant victory for the suffrage movement and for women's rights in the United States. It enshrined the principle of gender equality in the Constitution and granted millions of American women the right to participate in the political process. The successful culmination of the suffrage movement in the United States had a profound and lasting impact. It served as a catalyst for subsequent civil rights movements, as the fight for suffrage intersected with broader struggles for racial equality and social justice. The suffrage movement demonstrated the power of collective action, perseverance, and strategic activism in effecting social change. Chapter 8: Legacies and Lasting Impact. The women's suffrage movement stands as one of the most influential and transformative social movements in history. Its impact reverberated far beyond the achievement of voting rights for women, leaving a lasting legacy that shaped society and laid the groundwork for future advancements in women's rights. This chapter examines the legacies and lasting impact of the suffrage movement, highlighting its influence on gender roles, education, careers, social justice, and broader gender equality. One of the significant legacies of the suffrage movement was the challenging of traditional gender roles and expectations. Suffragettes advocated for women's rights to participate in the public sphere, breaking free from the confines of the domestic sphere. The fight for suffrage encouraged women to question and challenge societal norms, asserting their agency and autonomy. Women's increased involvement in political and civic affairs challenged the prevailing belief that women were inherently inferior or unfit for public life, leading to a re-evaluation of gender roles and expectations. The suffrage movement also inspired women to pursue education and careers. By demanding equal rights and opportunities, suffragettes emphasized the importance of education as a means of empowerment. The movement encouraged women to seek higher education and enter professions traditionally dominated by men. This shift not only expanded women's individual opportunities but also reshaped societal perceptions of women's capabilities and contributions. The suffrage movement contributed to the dismantling of barriers that had previously limited women's access to education and professional opportunities. Furthermore, the suffrage movement intersected with other social justice movements, such as the abolitionist movement and the fight for racial equality. Suffragettes recognized the interconnections between various forms of oppression and actively sought alliances with marginalized groups. Leaders such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton supported the rights of African Americans and advocated for the inclusion of Black women in the suffrage movement. These coalitions and alliances laid the foundation for future activism and influenced the trajectory of civil rights movements in the United States. The suffrage movement also played a pivotal role in the broader fight for gender equality. The demand for suffrage exposed the systemic discrimination and inequality faced by women in all aspects of life, including employment, legal rights, and social status. Suffragettes advocated for reproductive rights, including access to birth control and the right to make decisions about their own bodies. They fought for equal pay and fair treatment in the workplace. The suffrage movement challenged the deeply ingrained patriarchal structures of society, laying the groundwork for broader advancements in women's rights and the pursuit of gender equality. The achievements of the suffrage movement set important precedents for future activism and legal developments. The fight for suffrage demonstrated the power of collective action and grassroots organizing in effecting social change. Suffragettes employed innovative strategies such as marches, protests, and civil disobedience to raise awareness, challenge societal norms, and advocate for their cause. These tactics would later be employed by other social justice movements, including the civil rights movement and the feminist movement. The suffrage movement's impact on future generations cannot be overstated. The fight for suffrage inspired and empowered countless women to become agents of change. The memory of suffragettes' sacrifices and achievements motivated subsequent generations of women to continue the pursuit of equality and justice. The suffrage movement serves as a powerful reminder of the progress that can be achieved through collective action and the enduring legacy of those who fought for women's rights. Chapter 9, Conclusion. The women's suffrage movement stands as a remarkable chapter in the ongoing struggle for equality and human rights. From its origins at the Seneca Falls Convention to the eventual ratification of the 19th Amendment, suffragettes and suffragists fought relentlessly to secure the right to vote for women. Their unwavering commitment to justice and their indomitable spirit changed the course of history, empowering women and transforming societies worldwide. The women's suffrage movement emerged at a time when women's roles in society were tightly prescribed, relegating them to the domestic sphere and denying them the same rights and opportunities as men. The suffragettes and suffragists challenged these deeply ingrained gender norms and demanded political equality. They recognized that the right to vote was not only a fundamental aspect of citizenship but also a pathway to greater empowerment and social change. Throughout the movement's history, suffragettes and suffragists faced immense obstacles and formidable opposition. They encountered skepticism, ridicule, and even violence as they pressed for women's suffrage. Yet, they remained undeterred, driven by their unwavering belief in the inherent worth and equality of women. Their courage and resilience paved the way for significant achievements and progress. The suffrage movement's success hinged on the collective efforts of countless individuals, from the bold leaders who emerged as suffrage pioneers to the grassroots activists who worked tirelessly to garner support and raise awareness. Suffragettes and suffragists employed a diverse range of strategies, including organizing rallies and protests, engaging in civil disobedience, publishing newspapers and pamphlets, and advocating for legislative change. Their innovative and relentless approach to activism laid the groundwork for future social justice movements and set a powerful precedent for challenging systemic injustice. The impact of the suffrage movement extends far beyond the attainment of voting rights. By challenging traditional gender roles, suffragettes and suffragists sparked a broader societal shift in attitudes and expectations. They inspired generations of women to question the limitations imposed on them and to strive for education, careers, and equal treatment. The suffrage movement encouraged women to assert their agency, voice their concerns, and engage in the political process, making vital contributions to the development of democratic societies. Moreover, the suffrage movement intersected with other social justice causes, forging alliances and coalitions that reshaped the landscape of activism. Suffragettes recognized the interconnectedness of various forms of oppression and sought solidarity with movements such as the abolitionist movement and the fight for racial equality. These alliances not only strengthened the suffrage movement but also set a precedent for future collaboration in the pursuit of justice and equality. While the attainment of suffrage marked a significant milestone, the fight for equality did not end with the passage of the 19th Amendment. Women continued to face systemic discrimination and unequal treatment in various spheres of life. However, the legacy of the suffrage movement serves as an enduring source of inspiration and empowerment. It stands as a testament to the power of collective action, determination, and resilience in effecting social change. The struggle for gender equality persists, with ongoing challenges and barriers yet to be overcome. However, the legacy of the suffrage movement provides hope and guidance for future generations. It serves as a reminder that progress is possible, that the pursuit of justice requires tireless dedication, and that change can be achieved through the unwavering belief in a more equitable future. In conclusion, the women's suffrage movement remains an essential and defining chapter in the history of human rights and social progress. Suffragettes and suffragists transformed societies by demanding and securing the right to vote for women. Their remarkable courage, determination, and unwavering commitment to justice changed the course of history, empowering women and laying the foundation for future advancements in women's rights. While the fight for equality continues, the legacy of the suffrage movement stands as a powerful testament to the enduring power of collective action and the belief in a more just and equitable world. More information and facts. Part 1: Intersectionality, the multifaceted nature of the suffrage movement. The suffrage movement, while often seen as a unified struggle for women's voting rights, encompassed women from diverse backgrounds who faced intersecting forms of discrimination and oppression. Examining the intersectionality within the suffrage movement sheds light on the challenges faced by marginalized women and highlights the importance of inclusive and diverse activism in achieving social change. This chapter explores the multifaceted nature of the suffrage movement, addressing the experiences of women from different races, socioeconomic classes, and ethnicities, and their contributions to the fight for suffrage. The suffrage movement, particularly in the United States, was predominantly led by white middle and upper-class women. However, women from marginalized groups, including women of color, working-class women, and immigrant women, played vital roles in the fight for suffrage and navigated complex intersecting forms of discrimination. Women of color, including African American suffragettes such as Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, and Sojourner Truth, made significant contributions to the suffrage movement. They faced not only gender discrimination but also racial discrimination, often encountering resistance and exclusion from mainstream suffrage organizations. These women sought to address the dual oppressions they faced, emphasizing the intersectionality of race and gender in their activism. Their efforts challenged the limited scope of the suffrage movement and pushed for a more inclusive and equitable movement that recognized the unique challenges faced by women of color. Working-class women also played crucial roles in the suffrage movement, advocating for the rights and needs of working-class women and highlighting the economic inequalities that compounded their disenfranchisement. Women like Rose Schneiderman and Clara Lemlich were instrumental in organizing labor strikes and fighting for improved working conditions and workers' rights. They drew attention to the intersection of gender and socioeconomic class, emphasizing that the struggle for suffrage was intricately linked to broader struggles for economic justice and workers' rights. Immigrant women also contributed to the suffrage movement, often grappling with language barriers, cultural differences, and xenophobia. Leaders like Alva Belmont and Maud Wood Park worked to mobilize immigrant communities and bridge the gap between different cultures and languages. They recognized the importance of inclusive activism that encompassed the experiences and needs of immigrant women, recognizing that achieving suffrage required unity across diverse communities. Examining intersectionality within the suffrage movement highlights the challenges faced by marginalized women who had to contend with multiple forms of discrimination. These women confronted not only gender inequality but also racial, socioeconomic, and cultural barriers. Intersectionality emphasizes that different aspects of a person's identity interact and shape their experiences, and these intersecting forms of discrimination and privilege must be considered when striving for social change. The suffrage movement, while providing a platform for women's rights, was not always fully inclusive or sensitive to the experiences of marginalized women. Intersectionality underscores the importance of recognizing and addressing the unique challenges faced by women with intersecting identities. It calls for a more inclusive approach that centers the voices and experiences of marginalized women and seeks to dismantle all forms of oppression. The suffrage movement's failure to fully address intersectionality at the time should not diminish the contributions and significance of marginalized women within the movement. Despite facing additional barriers, women of color, working-class women, and immigrant women made substantial contributions to the suffrage movement, challenging its limitations and advocating for a more comprehensive and inclusive fight for equality. The importance of intersectionality within the suffrage movement extends beyond the historical context. It serves as a reminder that activism and social change must be mindful of the diversity and complexity of women's experiences. Inclusive and diverse activism not only strengthens movements but also ensures that the voices and concerns of all women are heard and addressed. Part 2: International Connections. The transnational nature of the suffrage movement. While Chapter 5 provided a glimpse into international perspectives on the suffrage movement, a deeper exploration of the global connections and influences on the movement is crucial to understanding its transnational nature and impact beyond national boundaries. Examining the exchange of ideas, alliances, and collaboration between suffrage activists in different countries sheds light on the interconnectedness of the movement and the ways in which suffragettes drew inspiration from and influenced one another. This chapter explores the international connections and influences on the suffrage movement, highlighting its transnational character and the significance of global solidarity in the fight for women's rights. The suffrage movement was not limited to individual countries but transcended national borders, with suffragettes and suffragists forming international connections and engaging in fruitful exchanges of ideas and strategies. Suffrage activists recognized the power of collaboration and drew inspiration from the successes and challenges faced by their counterparts in other countries. The first international gathering of suffragettes took place in 1896 at the International Congress of Women in Berlin, Germany. The Congress provided a platform for suffragettes from various countries to share their experiences and strategies, fostering a sense of solidarity and collaboration. This gathering set the stage for future international suffrage conferences and paved the way for ongoing transnational connections. One of the prominent figures in the international suffrage movement was Emmeline Pankhurst, the leader of the Women's Social and Political Union, WSPU, in the United Kingdom. Pankhurst and her daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, traveled extensively to forge alliances with suffrage activists in other countries and to spread the suffrage message. They formed important connections with suffragettes in the United States, including Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt. These transatlantic alliances strengthened the suffrage movement in both countries and facilitated the exchange of strategies and tactics. The international suffrage movement was further consolidated through the formation of international suffrage organizations. In 1904, the International Woman Suffrage Alliance, IWSA, was established, providing a platform for suffrage activists from around the world to collaborate and coordinate their efforts. The IWSA organized international congresses, where suffragettes from various countries could share their experiences, present papers, and plan joint strategies. The international congresses fostered a sense of unity and solidarity among suffrage activists, reinforcing the idea that the fight for women's suffrage was a global struggle. The suffrage movement in different countries influenced and inspired one another. For example, The militant tactics employed by the suffragettes in the United Kingdom had a profound impact on suffragettes in the United States. The bold actions of the British suffragettes, including hunger strikes, acts of civil disobedience, and window-smashing campaigns, captured the attention of suffragettes worldwide and motivated them to adopt more confrontational methods in their own struggle for suffrage. The suffrage movement in the United States also exerted influence on the global stage. The American suffragettes, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Alice Paul, participated in international suffrage conferences and used their experiences and strategies to inspire and support suffragettes in other countries. The United States, with its robust suffrage movement and significant resources, served as a beacon of hope and inspiration for suffragettes worldwide. Moreover, the suffrage movement drew inspiration from other global struggles for justice and equality. Suffragettes connected their fight for women's suffrage to broader social justice movements, such as the abolitionist movement and the fight against colonialism. They recognized the interconnectedness of various forms of oppression and advocated for the rights of marginalized groups. The suffrage movement was fueled by the belief in universal equality and justice, transcending national boundaries and striving for a more equitable world. The international connections and influences on the suffrage movement underscore the transnational nature of the struggle for women's rights. Suffragettes and suffragists recognized the power of collaboration, drawing inspiration from the successes and challenges faced by their counterparts in other countries. The formation of international suffrage organizations and the convening of international congresses provided platforms for suffragettes to share ideas, coordinate strategies, and strengthen their collective efforts. The global solidarity among suffrage activists not only enhanced the suffrage movement's impact but also created a sense of unity and shared purpose. Suffragettes understood that their fight for suffrage was part of a broader struggle for justice and equality. They saw themselves as part of a global movement, working collectively to challenge patriarchal norms and advocate for the rights of women. Part 3: Opposition and Resistance: The Challenges Faced by Suffragettes. While Chapter 4 briefly discussed the opposition encountered by suffragettes, a deeper exploration of the strategies, tactics, and arguments employed by anti-suffrage groups and individuals provides a more nuanced understanding of the broader societal context in which the suffrage movement operated. Examining the reasons behind the opposition and the various tactics used against suffragettes sheds light on the complexities of the fight for women's rights and highlights the challenges faced by suffragettes in their quest for equality. This chapter delves into the opposition and resistance encountered by suffragettes, exploring the motivations of anti-suffrage groups, the tactics employed against suffragettes, and the broader societal attitudes that shaped the suffrage movement. Opposition to women's suffrage arose from various quarters, including politicians, religious leaders, and even some women who believed that advocating for suffrage would upset the natural order of society. The opposition was rooted in deeply ingrained gender norms and the prevailing belief in women's domestic role as caregivers and supporters rather than active participants in the political sphere. Anti-suffrage groups argued that granting women the right to vote would disrupt traditional family structures, undermine the stability of society, and lead to a loss of moral values. Anti-suffrage propaganda played a significant role in mobilizing opposition and shaping public opinion. Caricatures and cartoons depicting suffragettes as unfeminine, radical, and uninterested in their traditional roles as wives and mothers were widely disseminated. Anti-suffrage rhetoric often centered on preserving the sanctity of the home and maintaining women's natural place in society. Opponents of suffrage sought to delegitimize suffragettes' demands by portraying them as threats to the social order and the family unit. Anti-suffrage groups also employed various tactics to counter the suffrage movement. They organized their own campaigns and demonstrations, emphasizing the supposed negative consequences of women's political participation. Anti-suffrage speakers traveled the country, spreading their message and rallying against suffragettes. They argued that women were not equipped to make informed political decisions and that granting them suffrage would disrupt the balance of power in governance. Some opponents of suffrage used their political influence to obstruct the suffrage movement. They lobbied against suffrage legislation and worked to prevent suffrage amendments from gaining support. Politicians who held conservative views on gender roles and traditional values were often at the forefront of anti-suffrage efforts. They sought to maintain the status quo and resist societal change. Religious opposition was also a significant force in the fight against suffrage. Some religious leaders argued that suffrage went against divine order and the teachings of Scripture. They contended that women's spiritual roles were distinct from men's and that suffrage would upset the God-given balance between the sexes. Religious arguments against suffrage often drew upon traditional interpretations of religious texts and conservative moral values. In addition to organized opposition, suffragettes faced hostility, ridicule, and even violence at the hands of anti-suffrage groups and individuals. Opponents disrupted suffrage rallies and meetings, physically assaulted suffragettes, and destroyed suffrage literature. Suffragettes endured arrests, imprisonment, and harsh treatment as they persisted in their struggle for equality. Understanding the opposition and resistance faced by suffragettes provides a more comprehensive understanding of the broader societal context in which the suffrage movement operated. The opposition was not limited to a few isolated individuals or groups but was deeply rooted in cultural norms, religious beliefs, and political ideologies of the time. Suffragettes faced formidable challenges as they sought to challenge entrenched power structures and advocate for their rights. The complexities of the opposition encountered by suffragettes highlight the importance of the suffrage movement and its significance as a transformative force in society. Suffragettes' demands for political equality challenged deeply ingrained beliefs and norms, paving the way for broader societal change. The suffrage movement served as a catalyst for questioning gender roles, advocating for women's rights, and inspiring future generations of activists. Part 4: Grassroots Activism: The Power of Ordinary Women in the Suffrage Movement. While the suffrage movement is often associated with prominent leaders and organizations, the grassroots activism and contributions of ordinary women played a crucial role in its success. Exploring the stories of lesser-known suffragettes and local suffrage organizations provides a more comprehensive understanding of the movement and highlights the importance of individual agency in effecting social change. This chapter delves into the world of grassroots activism within the suffrage movement, shedding light on the diverse range of women involved and the impact they had in shaping the fight for women's voting rights. The suffrage movement relied not only on the leadership and strategies of prominent figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Emmeline Pankhurst, but also on the tireless efforts of countless ordinary women who dedicated themselves to the cause. These women, often working outside the public eye, organized at the local level, mobilized communities, and played a critical role in building a groundswell of support for suffrage. Local suffrage organizations, often formed by women in their communities, were the backbone of grassroots activism. These organizations sprouted across the United States, Europe, and beyond, providing spaces for women to come together, plan strategies, and advocate for suffrage. They held meetings, hosted lectures, and organized fundraising events to generate support and raise awareness about women's rights. These local suffrage organizations allowed women to exercise their agency and take ownership of the movement. They provided platforms for women from diverse backgrounds to come together and work towards a common goal, fostering a sense of solidarity and unity. While the contributions of these ordinary suffragettes may not have received as much historical recognition, their efforts were instrumental in building momentum and sustaining the movement over time. One such grassroots activist was Alice Paul, a suffragette who played a pivotal role in organizing grassroots campaigns and demonstrations in the United States. She co-founded the National Woman's Party, NWP, and was a driving force behind the Silent Sentinels, a group of suffragettes who picketed the White House. Paul's tactics of nonviolent civil disobedience, including hunger strikes and public protests, galvanized public attention and put pressure on the government to address women's suffrage. The grassroots activism within the suffrage movement extended beyond prominent leaders like Alice Paul. Ordinary women across various regions and social strata contributed in different ways, leveraging their skills, resources, and networks to advance the cause. Some suffragettes wrote pamphlets and articles to spread the message of suffrage, while others used their artistic talents to create powerful visual propaganda. Women from marginalized communities, such as working-class women, women of color, and immigrant women, were also active participants in grassroots activism. For example, African American suffragettes like Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells fought for suffrage while simultaneously advocating for racial equality. Working-class suffragettes like Rose Schneiderman and Clara Lemlich played vital roles in organizing labor strikes and fighting for improved working conditions. The stories of these grassroots suffragettes demonstrate the power of individual agency and the collective impact of ordinary women. They defied societal expectations and pushed for societal change from the ground up. Through their local activism, they not only contributed to the suffrage movement but also inspired others and fostered a sense of empowerment among women in their communities. Grassroots activism also played a critical role in reaching out to diverse communities and bridging gaps in the suffrage movement. Suffragettes recognized that broadening the movement's appeal and engaging women from different backgrounds were essential for achieving success. They organized lectures and campaigns specifically tailored to address the concerns and interests of various communities, building coalitions and fostering solidarity across socioeconomic, racial, and ethnic lines. The contributions of grassroots suffragettes highlight the power of collective action and the importance of individual agency in effecting social change. Their efforts were not limited to the public sphere but extended into homes, workplaces, and community spaces. They engaged in conversations, challenged societal norms, and persuaded others to join the cause. Grassroots suffragettes served as the driving force behind the movement, embodying the belief that change starts at the grassroots level and that every individual has the power to make a difference. Part 5: The Post-Suffrage Era, Continuing the Fight for Gender Equality. The passage of the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, was undoubtedly a significant achievement for the suffrage movement. However, it marked not the end but rather a new chapter in the ongoing struggle for gender equality. Exploring the challenges and achievements of women in the post-suffrage era provides insight into the continued fight for equal rights and sheds light on the efforts to dismantle discriminatory laws and practices, as well as address gender-based inequalities in various spheres of life. This chapter delves into the post-suffrage era, examining the progress made, the obstacles faced, and the ongoing pursuit of gender equality. The post-suffrage era was marked by both achievements and setbacks. Women's suffrage fundamentally reshaped the political landscape, empowering women to participate in the democratic process and making their voices heard in matters of governance. Women mobilized politically, organized voter registration drives, and formed political organizations to advocate for their interests. The suffrage movement also set a precedent for future civil rights movements, inspiring women to continue the fight for equality in other arenas. However, the struggle for gender equality did not end with suffrage. Discriminatory laws and practices persisted, hindering women's full participation in society. Women still faced significant barriers in the workplace, including unequal pay, limited job opportunities, and discriminatory hiring practices. The glass ceiling remained a formidable obstacle, with women often finding it difficult to reach leadership positions and attain equal representation in various industries and professions. Moreover, women continued to experience gender-based discrimination in other areas, such as education, healthcare, and family law. In the post-suffrage era, women fought for access to higher education and professional training, seeking to break down barriers that limited their intellectual and economic potential. The struggle for reproductive rights emerged as a prominent issue, with women advocating for access to contraception, family planning, and the right to make decisions about their own bodies. The post-suffrage era also witnessed the emergence of feminist movements and organizations that sought to address the broader social and cultural factors that perpetuated gender inequality. Feminist activists such as Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem in the United States challenged traditional gender roles and norms, advocating for women's rights in the workplace, reproductive autonomy, and an end to gender-based violence. These movements highlighted the intersectionality of gender with other forms of discrimination, such as race, class, and sexuality, emphasizing the need for an inclusive and intersectional approach to feminism. Legally, progress was made in the post-suffrage era through the enactment of laws and policies aimed at dismantling discriminatory practices. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 in the United States, for example, prohibited employment discrimination based on sex, race, color, religion, and national origin. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 aimed to address the gender pay gap by requiring equal pay for equal work. However, despite these legislative advancements, achieving true gender equality remained an ongoing struggle. Throughout the post-suffrage era, women's rights activists continued to organize, mobilize, and push for change. They engaged in advocacy, lobbying, and public awareness campaigns to challenge discriminatory laws and practices. Grassroots activism and social movements played a pivotal role in driving change, with women taking to the streets, participating in demonstrations, and demanding gender equality. The post-suffrage era also witnessed the rise of international efforts to promote gender equality. The United Nations established the Commission on the Status of Women in 1946 to promote women's rights and gender equality globally. International conventions and treaties, such as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women (CEDAW) in 1979, provided a framework for addressing gender-based inequalities and promoting women's rights on a global scale. The struggle for gender equality in the post-suffrage era remains ongoing. Women's rights activists continue to challenge discriminatory laws and practices, advocate for equal representation in leadership positions, fight for reproductive rights, and address gender-based violence. Movements such as #MeToo and Time's Up have shed light on the pervasive nature of gender-based harassment and discrimination, igniting conversations and prompting actions to address these issues. The post-suffrage era serves as a reminder that achieving gender equality requires persistent efforts and a multifaceted approach. It demands not only changes in legislation and policy but also shifts in societal attitudes, cultural norms, and institutional practices. The fight for gender equality is interconnected with other social justice movements, such as racial justice, LGBTQ+ rights, and economic equity, highlighting the importance of intersectionality in advancing the cause of equality. Part 6: Legacy and Ongoing Activism. The enduring relevance of the suffrage movement. Examining the ways in which the suffrage movement and its achievements have influenced subsequent generations of activists and shaped ongoing feminist and social justice movements provides valuable insights into the continuity of the fight for equality. The suffrage movement's legacy is far-reaching, inspiring and informing contemporary struggles for justice and highlighting its enduring relevance. This chapter delves into the legacy and ongoing activism that emerged from the suffrage movement, exploring its impact on subsequent generations and its significance in contemporary battles for equality. The suffrage movement laid the foundation for subsequent waves of feminism and social justice activism. The fight for suffrage challenged deeply ingrained gender norms, sparked discussions about women's rights, and instilled a spirit of resilience and determination among activists. The suffragettes' unwavering commitment to justice and equality continues to inspire generations of women and marginalized communities to this day. One of the most prominent ways in which the suffrage movement's legacy endures is through the ongoing fight for women's political participation and representation. While suffrage granted women the right to vote, achieving true gender parity in political leadership remains a challenge. Women continue to advocate for equal representation in government bodies, pushing for policies and initiatives that address the underrepresentation of women in politics and decision-making positions. The suffrage movement serves as a reminder that political empowerment and participation are essential for achieving gender equality and shaping inclusive and representative democracies. The suffrage movement's influence extends beyond political realms. It has shaped and informed contemporary feminist movements, providing a historical context for current battles against gender-based discrimination, violence, and systemic inequalities. The suffragettes' strategies of collective action, grassroots organizing, and civil disobedience have inspired subsequent generations of activists. Today, movements like #MeToo, Time's Up, and global women's marches draw inspiration from the suffrage movement, demonstrating the intergenerational impact and resonance of its activism. Moreover, the suffrage movement's intersectional approach to activism and its recognition of the interconnectedness of various forms of oppression continue to inform contemporary social justice movements. Intersectional feminism, a framework that recognizes the intersecting nature of gender, race, class, and other identities, draws inspiration from the suffrage movement's efforts to address the unique challenges faced by women of color, working-class women, and other marginalized groups. The suffragettes' insistence on solidarity and inclusivity serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of centering the experiences of all women and fighting for justice on multiple fronts. The suffrage movement also paved the way for advancements in women's rights beyond political participation. It ignited conversations and actions regarding economic equality, reproductive rights, and social reforms. The fight for suffrage challenged societal expectations and paved the way for subsequent battles for reproductive autonomy, equal pay, access to education, and the dismantling of gender-based violence. The suffragettes' achievements laid the groundwork for addressing systemic gender-based inequalities in various spheres of life. Additionally, the suffrage movement's legacy has had a global impact, inspiring women's rights activism around the world. The fight for suffrage in one country often reverberated across borders, encouraging women in other nations to demand their rights. The suffrage movement's achievements in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom served as beacons of hope and inspiration for women in countries where suffrage had not yet been granted. The transnational connections forged during the suffrage movement continue to influence and shape international movements for women's rights today. In conclusion, the suffrage movement's legacy and ongoing activism have had a profound impact on subsequent generations of activists and continue to shape contemporary feminist and social justice movements. Its influence can be seen in the ongoing fight for political participation, the intersectional approach to activism, the broader battles for gender equality, and the global struggle for women's rights. The suffrage movement's unwavering commitment to justice, its strategies of collective action and civil disobedience, and its recognition of the interconnectedness of various forms of oppression continue to inspire and inform activism in the pursuit of equality and social change. Its enduring relevance serves as a reminder that the fight for equality is an ongoing journey, and the suffrage movement stands as a testament to the power of collective action, resilience, and the pursuit of justice. We've now reached the end of our journey today. Thank you for letting the tales of old be your backdrop, and remember, history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding our present and shaping our future.